When Portuguese navigators first reached the West African coast in the 15th century, they called it by the Moroccan Berber phrase, Akel in Uguanwan, land of the blacks. For generations thereafter, the Guinea coast, a center of gold and slave trade, was the only part of sub-Saharan Africa even vaguely known to most Westerners. Inland, through the great belt of forests, and northward to the old empires of the Sudan, was a vast network of trade routes linking a multitude of kingdoms, city-states, and communities of many different peoples. Only in the last century has the white man, or for that matter, other Africans, recognized the variety of sophisticated cultures that flourished in West Africa. This is a preliminary account on a group of workers of the coast of Ghana, variously referred to as canoemen, boatmen, or surf boatmen, whose activities as transporters or passengers and cargo began in the last quarter of the 15th century and continued to the middle of the 20th. The canoemen were vital in the African Holocaust. For the Portuguese, they were pawns in their plot for a big picture. The canoeman was the transport of slaves to ships, but also from ships to Elmina Castle, and from there slaves were sold to African merchants in exchange for gold. Graphically illustrated in a picture in Barbault's description of the coast of North and South Guinea, with the title canoes carrying slaves on board of ships at Menfro and Ward, for example, has noted that the supply of slaves to ships was entirely in African hands, a statement which, I believe, applies both to the African merchants who obtained the slaves in the first instances and to the canoemen who transported them. For the Portuguese at Elmina, the slave trade began probably shortly before 1500, involving the canoemen in the activity for the first time, an observation which was made by Reiki and Vogt. Likewise, Barbault has recorded that the merchants and factors on that coast pay for the commodities they buy, not only in gold, but in slaves, carrying 2, 3, or more aboard together in a canoe. Sometimes they in the matter carry great numbers of slaves aboard, at other times fewer, according as they happen to be at peace or war with their neighbors. Now, an account from Cape Coast Castle in 1777 also indicates the use of canoemen, in this case referred to as the waterside people, in the slave trade. Another great advantage that not only this Cape Coast Castle, but every other governor on the coast has over the shipping in point of trade is that every trader from the inland country pays to the waterside people a certain duty called canoe hire for every slave, etc., that they carry on board the shipping, to save which they, of course, carrying their slaves also to the forts. In August 1751, Thomas Melville, of Cape Coast Castle, also confirms for us the use of canoemen in slave transport in a note to the Royal African Company in London. While he lays here a French vessel on the way to Ouidah, I saw a great number of canoes from Anamabo and Moray go abroad loaded with slaves, of which he did not buy one. Evidently, there were occasions when the canoemen refused to transport slaves, if not for reasons of humanity, because of their agreed remuneration had not been paid on a previous occasion. Thus, in 1677, at the Cape Coast Castle, we learned that our free canoemen did but delay the ship, Arthur, and the master, and did engage in reconciling, that did not move and did not obey, and did but demand rum and substances they said was their due. The transport of slaves continued, although at a record rate, in post-abolition time. The risks were greater. Loss of life in skirmishes and naval engagements with the British, imprisonment, loss of damage of canoes, but so was the rate for the job. The canoe, carved and usually also burnt out from a single tree trunk, played a part in the history of the coastal lagoon and riverside peoples of West Africa, similar in importance to that of the horse in the savanna states. It ranged in size from the smallest fishing canoe to craft over 80 feet in length and capable of carrying in calm waters 100 men or more. Sails were often used, in addition to paddles and punt poles. The builders were specialists, usually living in the forest, where the most suitable trees were found. On the coast, the canoe was in use by the 16th century for trade with the European ships. For sea voyages, which, according to an account of the intrepid sailors of the Gold Coast, may have covered hundreds of miles, and for fishing up to a distance of about 10 miles from the shore. Not all those living on or near the coast ventured on the sea, and the distinction between the seafaring and non-seafaring peoples of Guinea may be explained by geographical and historical factors. Long-distance trade was carried on across the lagoons and far up the rivers. The early Arabic writers testify to the importance of the canoe on the Upper Volta.